Of all the tales written by Tolkien, there is perhaps no other that mattered to him as personally and as deeply as the tale of Beren and Lúthien. Maya Govanen Melanin Amenik Swilaid. My name's Rainbow Dave, and welcome to our first video in this new playlist all about the great tale of the mortal Beren and the elf maid Lúthien. And I am super excited to begin telling this amazing story in all the juicy detail it deserves, and I've got a whole 9-episode series coming soon. But for this video, I want to talk not about the characters of Beren and Lúthien or what they do, but instead about the story itself. Because this story really matters, both within the mythology of the Legendarium and also in our real world. It is a story that this year, in 2022, is going to turn 105 years old. And this story was so personally important to its author. And Professor Tolkien's relationship with this tale is as beautiful as it is sorrowful. But I'll get to that. First, I'm going to start at the beginning. And as I say, the beginning of this story's life is a really long time ago. The earliest draft was penned by Tolkien in 1917, so this story is older than like shortwave radio, or modern zips, or fortune cookies, or even frozen food. The fictional characters of Beren and Lúthien have loved each other for longer than people in the real world have been able to buy frozen food. Isn't that crazy? And even the time at which Tolkien wrote Beren and Lúthien is pretty fascinating. So, as I reckon many of you will probably know, in 1916, J.R.R. Tolkien took ill after fighting in the Battle of the Somme. He returned to England infirm and emaciated, and after being deemed medically unfit to return to World War I, he spent the rest of the war between hospitals and at garrison duties on the home front. And in the spring of 1917, he happened to be posted to a garrison in East Yorkshire. And there, Tolkien spent a day walking through the woods with his wife, Edith. And according to a letter that Tolkien wrote to his son, Christopher, in 1972, this day out with Edith was the source of the story that in time became the chief part of the Silmarillion. You see, Edith was Tolkien's Lúthien. He wrote to his son that I never called Edith Lúthien, but it was first conceived in a small woodland glade filled with hemlocks at Roos in Yorkshire. In those days her hair was raven, her skin clear, her eyes brighter than you have seen them, and she could sing and dance. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the plot of Beren and Lúthien right now, I'll begin that next week, but I will say this, just to kind of give you an understanding of why the story matters so much. Because Beren's first meeting with Lúthien is astoundingly similar to Tolkien's day out with Edith. We're told that after going through a particularly traumatic event, Beren is finally safe, and he's free to walk through the woods in summer. And in a woodland glade, Beren encounters Lúthien singing and dancing, surrounded by hemlock, with hair as dark as the shadows of twilight. And let me read for you 8 lines from the Song of Beren and Lúthien that describes this moment in a very poetic way. The leaves were long, the grass was green, the hemlock umbels tall and fair, and in the glade a light was seen of stars in shadow shimmering. Tinuviel was dancing there to music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair and in her raiment glimmering. Now, as I've said, if that sounds a little bit more poetic to you than the usual lines that I quote from Tolkien's books, that's because it is. What I just read there isn't actually a part of the Silmarillion at all. It is the first few lines of a poem that is recited to the hobbits by Aragorn on Weathertop. This is a song that exists within the world of Middle-earth. And I think this is a very important detail to note about the story as we move forward, because the great tale of Beren and Lúthien is a hugely significant part of Middle-earth's mythology from the perspective of the people living there thousands of years after the story happened. And Aragorn's song on Weathertop isn't even the only example of this story being told within the story of The Lord of the Rings. While Frodo climbs the stairs of Cirith Ungol, Sam tries to cheer him up by talking about the great tale they've landed in, and he specifically mentions the great tale of Beren. Sam says to Frodo, "Beren now? He never thought he was going to get that Silmaril from..." And then he gets into a load of really spoilery things that I'll talk about properly in a few videos' time. But Sam reminds Frodo that Beren was just like them. He had a lot of chances of turning back, only he didn't. He didn't know if the story would have a happy ending or a sad one, but he kept going anyway. And without wanting to give too much away here, there does come a moment in this story where Beren comes face to face with a Silmaril, and due to his actions, that Silmaril's light later ends up in the possession of Arwen's grandfather, Eärendil. The same light of Eärendil that Frodo is carrying inside the phial of Galadriel. So they really, truly, literally are all part of the same story. As Frodo says, the great tales don't ever end. The people in them come and go when their parts ended. Tolkien called Beren and Lúthien the kernel of the mythology and the chief of the stories of the Silmarillion. And he even goes on to say that in this story, we meet, among other things, the first example of the motive that the great policies of world history, the wheels of the world, are often turned not by the lords and governors, even gods, but by the seemingly unknown and weak. It is Beren, the outlawed mortal who succeeds, with the help of Lúthien, where all the armies and warriors have failed. Does that sound at all familiar? And this isn't even the only massively important theme of Tolkien's that appears for the first time in the tale of Beren and Lúthien. Elves marrying men is an incredibly rare event in Tolkien's writings, but it's an incredibly important one, and we're explicitly told of it happening 4 times throughout all the ages of Arda. Now, one of these is just kind of a little bit of a legend that's sort of its own little wrinkle in the story of Gondor, which I go into in this video, but the other 3 are all very much 3 parts of a larger whole. First, there is Beren and Lúthien. Second, there is the lesser-known couple of the First Age, Tuor and Idril, who I will get to in good time, and the son of Tuor and Idril is that half-elven badass that I mentioned a few moments ago, Eärendil. And of all the people that Eärendil could possibly have gone on to marry, he married the granddaughter of Beren and Lúthien. And the granddaughter of Beren and Lúthien's granddaughter is Arwen, the 3rd elf maiden to marry a mortal man of the Edain, or Dún Edain in this case. And just to hammer this point home even further, Aragorn can also trace his ancestry back to both Tuor and Idril and to Beren and Lúthien. And when Aragorn and Arwen first meet, they do so while Aragorn is walking through a woodland glade, and as he walks we are told that he sings to himself the Lay of Lúthien. And then, suddenly, Lúthien walked before his eyes. Except, of course, it's not Lúthien. It is Lúthien's great-great-granddaughter, Arwen. And Aragorn immediately falls in love with her, and he even calls her Tinuviel, which is the exact same name that Beren gave to Lúthien thousands of years before. So, what I find so lovely is that Aragorn, Beren, and Tolkien all shared this same moment where they witnessed a raven-haired woman who they loved immensely singing and dancing beneath the leaves of a peaceful forest. There is a wonderfully poignant connection between the love that Beren had for Lúthien and the love that Tolkien had for Edith, which is actually incredibly heartbreaking, but I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. Because, before I do, there is something else that's really important to point out about this tale, And it makes it really quite different from the other previous First Age tales that I've talked about. Because although all of the Silmarillion grew out of much older writings, Beren and Lúthien is a story that Tolkien wrote and rewrote so many times throughout his life that what we now have is 3 completely distinct versions, each one with dozens and dozens of drafts, and each one written at a very different time in Tolkien's life. And so this can make things quite complicated when it comes to discerning like our own individual headcanons of what actually happened within the wider world of Middle-earth. But I'll spend a little bit of time right now talking about these 3 versions, and the absolute oldest version of this story is the one that Tolkien began in 1917, which he called The Tale of Tinuviel. And the earliest version of that earliest version no longer exists. Christopher Tolkien tells us that his father's very first Beren and Lúthien draft exists only in the ghostly form of a manuscript in pencil that his father all but entirely erased. However, it is the subsequent drafts of this earliest version that are now known as the Tale of Tinuviel, and they can be found in the Book of Lost Tales. But this earliest version is really quite different to the story that we get later in the Silmarillion, although there are quite a few details in the most recent version that are completely unchanged from the earliest version. But I guess there are really 3 main differences to talk about between the Tale of Tinuviel and the final story of Beren and Lúthien, and the first one is that in the Tale of Tinuviel, Beren is not actually a mortal man. Instead, he is one of the Noldor, or the Gnomes, as they were called way back in the beginning of Tolkien's process. And I find this fascinating because, in my mind, one of the most important parts of the Beren and Lúthien story is that of a mortal falling in love with an immortal. And yet, that was a detail that only came into fruition in later versions. Anyway, the second big change is that the character of Finrod Felagund, who plays an incredibly important role in the final story, is completely absent from the Tale of Tinuviel, and so are the 2 sons of Feanor that are also incredibly important in the story. And I think this is because, as the Legendarium kind of came together in Tolkien's mind, he found ways to make everything feel more connected. But these connections weren't necessarily present all the way back in 1917. The Legendarium evolved over time. And the third major change between the Tale of Tinuviel and the story of Beren and Lúthien is a wonderful detail that I am actually quite glad was cut from the final version, but it is such an awesome insight into Tolkien's early imagination. So, another very familiar face who's going to play a vital role in Beren and Lúthien is the character of Sauron. He is someone that I'm going to talk a lot about in upcoming videos, but back in 1917, the part that is now played by Sauron was played by another villain who serves an incredibly similar purpose in the narrative. And this villain is called Tevildo, the Prince of Cats. And as his name suggests, Tevildo is a giant cat, or rather he is an evil fae in beast-like shape. But although you may be thinking that this Tevildo cat and Sauron have nothing whatsoever in common, they actually do have a few similarities. In both stories, they are both Morgoth's top lieutenant. They both capture Beren in quite a similar way, and without wanting to unduly get into spoilers, they are both defeated in almost the exact same way, by the exact same character. And that character is a giant dog. So I think it's fair to say that one of the central themes of the original Tale of Tinuviel is cats versus dogs. Which, I don't know, it seems kind of hilarious to me. And it may even be a bit of an insight into Tolkien's personality, because it turns out the dude was not a cat person. In this video, I talked about the creepy cats of the evil Queen Beruthiel. And, get this, in 1951, in real life, a cat-breeding fan wrote to Tolkien and they asked his permission to name one of their cats after a character from The Lord of the Rings. Now, I have no idea how Tolkien responded to that fan, but following this request, he wrote a private letter to his publishers, and in that letter he said, "I fear that to me, cats belong to the fauna of Mordor." although you need not tell the cat breeder that. Isn't that hilarious? Cats are the fauna of Mordor? Jesus, Tolkien tells how you really feel. I like cats. I used to have a cat called Lúthien, although apparently Tolkien would not approve of that. Anyway, in future versions of the tale, Tevildo, the Prince of Cats, becomes Sauron, the Lord of Werewolves. And so the whole cats versus dogs theme is replaced by wolves versus dogs, which I think does work a bit better. However, before Tevildo evolved into Sauron, there was a kind of halfway point, and he was briefly a necromancer that Tolkien called Thu. Which brings us to the second version of the story, the Lay of Lathian. Now, unlike the Tale of Tinuviel and the story of Beren and Lúthien, the Lay of Lathian is not written in prose like a traditional story. Instead, it is written as an epic poem. And this poem demonstrates another one of Tolkien's many talents. Because when I say epic poem, I mean that in like the most literal sense of the words. The Lay of Lathian, and by the way, lay is just an old medieval word pertaining to a rhymed story of chivalry, love, and Celtic supernatural elements, all of which are present in this lay. Anyway, it is 4,223 lines long. It is written entirely in rhyming couplets, and the whole thing is in iambic tetrameter. Not only did Tolkien create an epic story, he wrote it in the form of a historically authentic medieval poem. Crazy. And another way that the Lay of Lathian differs from the Tale of Tinuviel is that in this poetic version, the plot is more or less exactly the same as in the final story. There are a few differences. For example, Sauron, as I just said, he is called Thu, and the Noldor are still called gnomes. But other than that, it is pretty much the final story, just written a lot more creatively. And so, over the course of these coming videos, I will occasionally bring in information from the Lay of Lathian that expands upon the story in the published Silmarillion. Although, if you are inspired to read this poem for yourself, I must warn you in advance, although it is over 4,000 lines long, it isn't finished. Tolkien began writing it in 1925 whilst working at the University of Leeds, but in 1931 he abandoned it and began working on other projects, among which was, of course, The Hobbit. And the final line of the Lay of Lathian is like the biggest cliffhanger ever. And so if you want to know how the story ends, you will have to turn to the final version of Beren and Lúthien, the one that's published in the Silmarillion. But just before I move on to that, you may very understandably be wondering why I'm pronouncing Lúthien so weirdly when I say the Lay of Lathian. And the answer to that is that I'm not saying Lúthien, I am saying lathian. And lathian is a Sindarin word that means release from bondage. And it really is, it's just a coincidence that Lathian sounds so similar to the name of one of its most major characters, Lúthien. But this is made even more confusing by the fact that in The Lord of the Rings, Aragorn totally does sing a song called The Lay of Lúthien, which exists as a song within the fiction of Middle-earth, but it was never written in full by Tolkien. Anyway, as I say, the final version of this tale is the story of Beren and Lúthien that is published as chapter 29 of the Silmarillion. And when it comes to, canon, this is the one that we should probably really stick to. This story is completely compatible with the rest of the Legendarium, and so as we move forward with this series, it is this final version that I will talk most about in future videos. But before I finish this video, I do want to return to what I was saying earlier about how and why this story mattered so much to Professor Tolkien. So, as you'll all know, Lúthien is an immortal, and Beren is not. So, it's probably not too much of a spoiler to say that at some point in the First Age, Beren dies, and he leaves Lúthien alone in the world to grieve him. But, tragically, this is not how things went for Tolkien and Edith. In 1971, Edith died, and Tolkien was left alone. He wrote to his son Christopher that the story has gone crooked, and I am left. In the same letter, he went on to talk about falling in love with Edith and the dreadful sufferings of our childhoods from which we rescued one another. and how these never touched our depths nor dimmed our memories of our youthful love. Forever, especially when alone, we still met in the woodland glade, and we went hand in hand many times to escape the shadow of imminent death before our last parting. And in another letter to another son, Tolkien wrote, "I fell in love with your mother at the approximate age of 18. Your mother was older than I and not a Catholic, which may not seem like a big deal in the 21st century, but I think the fact that Tolkien and Edith fell in love despite being from different worlds is another parallel that they share with Beren and Lúthien." Anyway, Tolkien went on to write, "I met the Lúthien Tenuviel of my own personal romance, with her long dark hair, fair face and starry eyes, and beautiful voice. But now she has gone before Beren, leaving him indeed one-handed." Which is a bit of a spoiler, but I include it because it is such a heartbreakingly beautiful sentiment. Tolkien was so emotionally honest with his sons, and the way he writes about Edith is exquisite. So, as I end this video, I'll leave you with this. In Oxford, not far away from the house where Tolkien and Edith lived, there is a graveyard called Wolvercott Cemetery, and there, Edith was buried in 1971. 21 months later, Tolkien was buried beside her. And on their shared tombstone in real life are inscribed the words, Beren and Lúthien. So, guys, thank you very much for the view. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you enjoy the next 10 weeks of diving deep into the most complete and the most beloved of all Tolkien's great tales. To make sure you don't miss that, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and leave a comment on this video if you want to. Anyway, until next time, my dear friends, as always, much love. Stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.